my pleasure to bring to you Miss Sophia Labonte and her paper, Men and Supermen, an examination of heroism in the epics.
There are few people who are not awed by a demonstration of courage or strength or resolve or some other nobility of character which overwhelmingly eclipses their own capabilities. There is, as Charlotte Bronte describes it, an organ of veneration in the human soul which instinctively recognizes the qualities of excellence and renders them, either by laudatory words or silent admiration, the praise which is their due. Fickle creatures that we are often inclined to subvert the use of this organ to reflect the criteria of our own tastes and situations. A young boy in the Little League idolizes the pitcher for the Yankees merely on account of his unusual aptitude for causing a spherical object about 3 inches in diameter to travel with speed and precision toward a certain location some yards distant. Tearful exclamations of, "Oh, so-and-so is my hero," are frequently made regarding persons notable only insofar as they embody a quality especially esteemed by the speaker, without reference to the subject's performance upon the scales of virtue. However, in spite of the prevalence of this arguably childish and certainly subjective treatment of heroism, there is a more common and perhaps a more objective understanding of the heroic reflected in the fascination of this age with the hackneyed installments of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the fascination of ages past with the characters portrayed in classic myths and fairy tales. No more common conception of the heroic exists than that of the proverbial knight in shining armor galloping across the scene in a blaze of glory and carelessly doing battle with some great colossal serpent, paying no heed whatever to its monstrous size or to the furnace emanating from its jaws. What do they matter to him? Has he not dealt with worse more times than can be counted? He has the power to vanquish the mighty, to prevail against all odds by the sheer force of his mind and body. He is the observed of all observers, the admired of all admirers, the shining figure in the midst of the painting at whom we all gaze with open mouths and beating hearts, for what could possibly be more heroic? We should not allow ourselves, however, to be carried away by this image, or to spring precipitously to the reply, nothing in the world. Remove the distractions posed by the glamorous context and the display of raw strength, it may be easily seen that what remains, the simple action of confronting great danger for the sake of others, is not limited to the glorious warrior only. It is, in fact, more nobly done by the trembling farmer who confronts the dragon, pitchfork in hand, not because he himself is capable, but because none other can be found, and because he cannot bear the thought that the town he loves may be laid in ruins. If the knight adheres in his heart to the dictates of chivalry, no difference exists between himself and the valorous peasant save in ability, an admirable trait, but by no means necessarily heroic. Any successful villain is capable. Our knight, then, though he serves us well as an example of heroism, cannot serve as its definition. But with what shall we replace him? What defines that proper object of our admiration, hero? In questing after the nature of heroism, there can be no better place to begin than the Greek epics. It is no accident that our dictionary devotes several entries under the word hero to the connotations given by the poetry of Homer, the Iliad in particular. It is from Homer that we draw the concept of the epic hero, that legendary captain of war whose superior skill and courage enable him to perform superhuman feats and to change the course of history with his own 2 hands. For the sake of the perspective given by comparison, we shall likewise approach a more modern epic. This may be found in Tolstoy's War and Peace, the scope and content of whose narrative render it a fit contrast to the Homeric epics. And contrast it does, for Tolstoy entirely rejects the possibility of the epic hero, arguing that though a man may be the commander of thousands, he is yet ultimately subject to the individual wills of each, and to the innumerable divergent circumstances which intertwine to form the substance of reality, of which he has little knowledge and no control. The disconnect between the 2 authors is evident. Homer's characters hold a potency approaching the divine, whereas those of Tolstoy are burdened with every possible limitation of mortality. In spite, however, of their superficial differences upon the value of the legendary qualities of epic heroes, Homer and Tolstoy agree that the fundamental characteristics of a true hero are his willingness to interact with his fellows with empathy and humility, and his ability to conquer himself that he might act for the sake of others. These common principles may be demonstrated in the comparison of Homer's hero Achilles and Tolstoy's Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, the parallels in whose motivations, narrative arcs, and thematic resolutions illustrate the preeminence of humanity in the nature of a hero. Homer's Iliad brings the world of epic heroism into full display. It relates the tale of the mighty men of old in the struggle for Troy, the legacy of whose deeds rings throughout the centuries with all the splendor of impossible glory. Homer's narrative is conveyed exclusively in the superlative degree. Odysseus is the craftiest man alive, Hector the noblest, Thersites the ugliest, Nestor the wisest, Paris the most spineless. Taking center stage among these epically dimensioned figures is the quintessential epic hero, Achilles, the mightiest warrior in the Argive army, the story of whose rage constitutes the plot of the Iliad. The narrative of Achilles begins with his altercation with Agamemnon and his ensuing withdrawal from the battle for Troy. Overcome by the sting of the dishonor dealt him by Agamemnon in the seizing of Briseis, Achilles abandons the Argive forces and confines himself and his men to their own encampment. He then takes steps to ensure that Agamemnon and the entire army suffers for the insult, praying to his mother to persuade Zeus, quote, to pin the Achaeans back against the ships, trap them all around the bay, and mow them down, so all can reap the benefits of their king. So even mighty Atrides can see how mad he was to disgrace Achilles, the best of the Achaeans. Blinded by a personal grudge, Achilles forsakes his duty to the Achaean warriors. Rather than leading them to attain the victory of which his surpassing military prowess renders him perfectly capable, he chooses to actively bring destruction on them in order to assuage his injured pride and ensure a situation in which he might fulfill his obsession with personal glory. Even when his end is achieved and an embassy is dispatched to beg his pardon and offer him recompense for the humiliation he has undergone, Achilles refuses to return, vowing that he will never again arm for battle until the Trojans have pillaged the camp and amassed about his own ships. Homer's criticism of Achilles rings clearly through the voice of Ajax, who rebukes Achilles, calling him a ruthless man with not a thought for his comrade's love. Achilles' lack of empathy for the soldiers at whose expense he desires to purchase glory renders his possession of the characteristic powers of the epic hero comparatively unimportant, showcasing the greater value of simple human charity. Finally, when the Trojans press the Achaean armies back against the ships, slaying them in droves and wounding their bravest men, Achilles is confronted by his friend Patroclus, who comes to him weeping for the needlessly fallen. Achilles, hardened still by his selfish grudge, asks sardonically as Patroclus is weeping over the Argives, seeing them die against their hollow ships repaid for their offenses. Homer draws a stark contrast between Achilles' cruelty and Patroclus' compassion, distinguishing Patroclus by adjusting his narrative to the second person and addressing him directly. Quote, with a wrenching groan you answered your friend Patroclus, O my rider, Achilles, such heavy blows have overwhelmed the troops. You are intractable, Achilles. What good will a man, even one in the next generation, get from you unless you defend the Argives from disaster? But still, if deep down some prophecy makes you balk, some doom your noble mother would feel to you from Zeus, well and good. At least send me into battle quickly, that the whole Myrmidon army follow my command. I might bring some light of victory to our Argives. Patroclus, a lesser warrior than the godlike Achilles, and a far greater man, thinks only of the well-being of the Achaean forces, demonstrating the human feeling so deficient in his friend. Achilles, swayed by Patroclus' words, but still clinging to the sting of his quarrel, allows Patroclus to set forth alone to meet his death at the hands of Hector. Upon receiving the news of Patroclus' death, Achilles is hit by the full force of his own selfishness, and bewails the consequences of his actions, saying, I did not bring one ray of hope to my Patroclus, nor to the rest of all my steadfast comrades, countless ranks struck down by mighty Hector. No, here I sit by the ships, a useless weight upon this good green earth. I, no man my equal among the bronze-armed Achaeans. At this point in the narrative, a transformation occurs in Achilles' character. In awakening to the loss of his noble friend, Achilles awakens likewise to the loss of every other Argive whom he sacrificed to his own pride. Chastened by guilt and humility, Achilles experiences a shift in motivation. His petty quarrel with Agamemnon is abandoned, and he rushes into battle, driven not only by the desire to achieve glory while his life lasts, but also to save his exhausted friends from headlong death and to avenge his fallen comrade. Through the example and death of Patroclus, Achilles has approached a step closer to true heroism. When once again upon the battlefield, Achilles finds only fleeting satisfaction in the slaying of Hector and the glory accompanying. He buries Patroclus and holds funeral games in his honor, but is racked with restlessness and pain. But Achilles kept on grieving for his friend, the memory burning on, and all subduing sleep could not take him. Dawn on dawn flaming over the sea and shore would find him pacing. Having found his dreams of glory worthless in comparison with his lost friend, Achilles attempts to relieve his bitterness and misery by abusing Hector's corpse. The cycle continues day after day, Achilles drowning himself in his rage and grief, until the gods intervene, aiding Priam, king of Troy, to enter the Argive camp to plead for the return of his son's body. Priam approaches Achilles, begging, "Revere the gods, Achilles. Pity me in my own right. Remember your own father." Those words stirred within Achilles a deep desire to grieve for his own father. Taking the old man's hand, he gently moved him back, and overpowered by memory, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept freely for men killing Hector, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus once more, and their sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. Roused at last to pity and humanity, Achilles completes the final stage in his approach to heroism. In this moment of reconciliation, Achilles' superhuman pride is subjected to his human sorrow, and he is enabled to deal graciously with his enemy, surrendering the body of Hector and inviting Priam to share a meal with him. Having made this final transition of character, Achilles' rage is spent and his grief subdued. Achilles sleeps at last. His story has been resolved. The fact that Achilles finds resolution not in glory, not in vengeance, but in reconciliation, indicates that Homer, when considering the nature of heroism, envisions something more than mere courage or prowess. Even in the world of epic heroes, true heroism has a great deal more to do with a man's humanity than his superhumanity. In contrast to the landscapes of ancient and supernatural proportions which Homer describes in the Iliad, in which man may defy the gods and emerge victorious, Tolstoy, in War and Peace, presents his readers with a world in which the individual human being has very little effect upon the course of history. Rather than arranging a cast of a few giants, Tolstoy instead peoples his novel with myriads of little characters, which swarm across the pages like ants, each very limited in his sphere of influence. He categorically denies the reality of the epic hero, arguing that even kings are the slaves of history. In fact, Tolstoy argues, no event, great or small, can ever take place without the conjunction of countless tiny and even insignificant causes. Even the Napoleonic War with Russia serves as no exception. Tolstoy contends that the supposed great figures of Russia and France had no more control over the event than did the thousands of men whom they commanded. The actions, Tolstoy says, of a Napoleon and Alexander, on whose word it seems to have depended whether the war took place or not, were as little willed as the actions of the soldier who went into the campaign by law or by conscription. For the will of Napoleon or Alexander to be fulfilled, the coincidence of countless circumstances was necessary, without any one of which the event could not have taken place. It was necessary that millions of men, in whose hands the actual power lay, should agree to fulfill the will of isolated and weak men. Whereas Homer attributes the slaughter of the Argives to the courage of Hector and the absence of Achilles, and even traces the cause of the entire Trojan War to the devastating beauty of Helen, Tolstoy makes it very clear that the Napoleonic War with Russia, though it bears Napoleon's name, is in fact the work of no one person in particular. There is no centralization of responsibility. To Tolstoy, the epic hero, breaker of gods and men and history alike, is an imaginary species, the fruit of futile human presumption, and entirely inconsistent with the actual world. The quixotic nature of epic heroism in a Tolstoyan world is a rather unfortunate fact for Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, one of the three principal characters of War and Peace, and a novel's central would-be epic hero. Disgusted by the hypocrisy of the drawing rooms of high society, in which gossip reigns supreme and social monarchs execute campaigns of manipulation with exceeding smoothness, Andrei rejects the domestic sphere of life altogether, directing his ambition to the realm of the army. Though of moderate stature, no one would dream of pitting him with Achilles in a contest of height, Andrei indulges in Achillean dreams of military glory, fantasizing about the possibility of rising to lead the Russian army to a victory great as Napoleon's legendary Toulon. When the French capture the bridge of Tavor, putting Kutuzov's force of 40,000 in danger of total destruction before they can join with the greater Russian army, Andrei leaps at the chance to accompany the small division commissioned with extenuating the Schöngraben action, an attempt to forestall the attacking French while the remainder of the Russian army escapes. But as soon as he learned that the Russian army was in such a hopeless situation, it occurred to him that it was precisely he who was destined to lead the Russian army out of that situation, that here was the Toulon which was to take him out of the ranks of unknown officers and open for him the first path to glory. Andrei, like Achilles, begins his narrative with a selfless obsession for his own reputation, glorying in the opportunity provided by the endangerment of his compatriots. During the Schöngraben action, Andrei is frustrated in his glorious schemes, Failing to accomplish anything particularly noteworthy, the battle itself meeting with unexpected success due merely to a grave error made by the French general. He is further baffled by the behavior of his commander, General Bagration, who, rather than actively attempting to micromanage every detail of his soldiers' actions and strategy, merely conveys the impression that he is doing so, in spite of his actual powerlessness over the situation. In thus frustrating Andrei's egotistical ambitions, Tolstoy reiterates his position that the superhuman potency has no part in the nature of a hero. Andrei's next apparent opportunity to make a name for himself occurs some weeks later at the Battle of Austerlitz. On the eve of this first truly decisive battle between the French and the Russian-Austrian alliance, Andrei renews his fantasies of a heroic moment which may set his name in the annals of history. I don't know what will happen, he thinks, but I want this, want glory, want to be known by people, want to be loved by them. It's the only thing I want, the only thing I live for. The battle begins, and in a few minutes becomes a rout. The Russians are in full retreat, and the French are at their heels. Seizing upon this glorious opportunity, Andrei picks up a fallen standard and rallies the fleeing Russians to mount a charge at the attacking French. Having succeeded in single-handedly rescuing the Russians from immediate disaster, Andrei is promptly delivered a grievous injury and falls unconscious upon the battlefield. When he awakens, however, with carnage all about him and a splitting pain inside his head, Andrei is totally disillusioned with his quest for glory. At the very moment in which he attains his end of general recognition, having been acknowledged by Napoleon himself for his exceptional bravery, he finds his dream to be utterly unsatisfying, childish, meaningless. Tolstoy uses Andrei's experience at the Battle of Austerlitz to emphasize the futility of epic heroism in the absence of true heroism, of glorious deeds formed with only selfish motivation. Andrei, like Achilles, begins his story with an insatiable desire for glory. Like Achilles, Andrei comes to realize that glory cannot fill the place into which he set it, cannot be the only worthy goal and means of satisfaction a man can achieve. And, like Achilles, he finds resolution and true heroism in a moment of reconciliation. Having returned home to Russia, Andrei falls in love with Natasha Rostov, the young and beautiful daughter of a declining count. He informally engages himself to her, but wishing to abide by his father's stipulation that the marriage should be delayed for 1 year, he agrees to wait, and leaves to Germany upon matters of personal business. When he returns, however, his fiancée has betrayed him, having attempted to elope with Anatole Kuragin, one of the most pestilential scoundrels ever to debase a Muscovite parlor. Deeply hurt and embittered, Andrei casts off Natasha and, ignoring her miserable penitence, returns to the army to take part in the Battle of Borodino, not as a member of the Emperor's entourage, but as a foot soldier. In the battle, Andrei is fatally wounded and brought to the shambles which serves as the hospital in the field. There, he recognizes Anatole Kuragin, dying and in agony. And inspired by the memories of Natasha and by rapturous pity for the wreck of the man which lies before him, Andrei undergoes a significant change. In the face of sorrow and death, he releases his bitterness and pride, and forgives Natasha for her act of perfidy, forgives even Anatole, thinking to himself, compassion, love for our brothers, love for those who love us, love for those who hate us, love for our enemies, that love that God preached on earth and which I didn't understand. That's why I was so sorry about life. Andrei realizes that his discontentment, his dissatisfaction with glory in battle, his resentment toward Natasha can be traced to his own lack of charity. He vividly pictured Natasha to himself, not as he had pictured her before, with her loveliness alone, which brought him joy, but for the first time he pictured her soul, and he understood her feeling, her suffering, shame, repentance. For the first time now, he understood all the cruelty of his refusal, saw the cruelty of his break with her. Having come to this realization, he is able to humble himself under the influence of his newfound charity, and when he is brought to Natasha's house, a dying man, he greets her without reproach, extending forgiveness and mending their broken relationship. This reconciliation marks the resolution of Andrei's narrative. Having accomplished it, he is overcome by his wound and by his weariness, and dies with Natasha by his side. The significance of reconciliation in relationship to the resolution of one of the narrative's principal characters is as present with Andrei as it is with Achilles. Tolstoy clearly wishes his readers to understand that Andrei's transformation from a self-centered warmonger to a humble extender of charity is far more valuable than any deed which Andrei could have accomplished, or dreamed of accomplishing upon the battlefield, and likewise far more worthy of admiration. In other words, Tolstoy argues the vast superiority of heroism to epic heroism. It is plain that Tolstoy and Homer are not entirely agreed upon the nature of heroism. To see this, one need only consider the contrast in the way in which each author treats the great figures of history. Menelaus, Ajax, Diomedes, and many others are portrayed by Homer as admirable and heroic simply on account of their magnificent valiance in battle. Homer, naturally enough, does homage to the epic heroism for its own sake. Tolstoy, on the other hand, entirely rejects the notion of the epic hero, depicting his own great military figures as insignificant, petty, and helpless without the strength of numbers at their backs. The contrast between the two authors' estimation of epic heroism is evident. Equally evident, however, is their remarkable concordance upon the value of simple heroism. Both demonstrate through the narrative arcs of their characters that heroism, defined as the charitable willingness to act for the sake of others, inspired by shared humanity, is far more precious than the most glorious feats a man can perform. What then is heroism? What is the nature of that quality which naturally inspires its observers with respect and admiration? If we are to assume the position of the epics, we must conclude that it is, in its essence, selflessness put into action by men with broken souls. It is a subjection of pride to humility, of selfishness to charity. It is present in the calming of Achilles' rage. It is present in the relinquishment of Andre's bitterness. It is present in the reconciliations experienced by both. It is displayed to the greatest advantage not in man's strength, but in spite of his weakness, not in his perfection, but in spite of his flaws. For the first obstacle which a hero must overcome is himself. The one who can accomplish this is truly worthy object of our respect.
Thank you very much, Ms. Labonte. I would like you to begin by just simply expounding upon your last line, as it seems a little cryptic. It says the first obstacle which a hero must overcome is himself. Heroism is oftentimes described as overcoming others. What do you mean by heroism as defined by overcoming oneself?
Well, as we can see with the example of both Achilles and Andre, their primary difficulties throughout the stories are posed not by others presenting difficulties to them, but rather by their own characters presenting obstacles to them finding both success and satisfaction in their deeds. With Achilles, you see that his own character flaw, pride, stands as an obstacle between him and essentially overcoming the Trojans, which is what they're all there to do. And it is only when he can overcome his own character flaws that he can actually attain anything great. And so that's sort of what I mean by the first obstacle the hero must overcome is himself. Before you can do anything in the outside world, you have to have a command over your own heart. You can't do anything without that.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that a man who is truly heroic then, if he has overcome himself, can be heroic while being, you might say, an exclusively private man?
Could you give an example?
Someone who has very little to do with, you might say, the stage of human history, the course of human events, one who lives privately. I always like the Greek term idios, to oneself, where we get the term idiot from. And so all of the heroes that you describe, at least in terms of Achilles, live on a very grand stage that involves other people knowing about them, directing the course of other people, living on a grand stage. And so if heroism is primarily defined by the ability to conquer oneself, can that be an individual who has very much a private life?
Is this individual having a private life by his own choice?
I hadn't thought of that. I don't say it'd be necessarily so. But you could imagine someone who conquers his own internal nature and goes and builds a cabin in the outback of Alaska and dies alone. Is that incompatible with what you would think would be a correct concept of heroism?
Yes, I think so, because I think that as it demonstrated by both Achilles and Andre, the result of their overcoming themselves is to go then and act for the sake of other people. And I think that part of overcoming yourself is recognizing, as both Achilles and Andres do, your own, I guess what they would say, their relative insignificance in comparison to what they previously thought of themselves. And so that gives them a value for other people, which is then, that is all a part of overcoming yourself. And when you have conquered, when these people have conquered their internal problems, shall we say, they are then enabled to go forth and do things that benefit other people. I would possibly think that I don't know that you could say that a person who goes and builds a cabin does have a complete regulation over themselves in the sense that I mean, because he's not stewarding his capabilities on behalf of other people, and that is part of what I mean by heroism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess oftentimes when people talk about heroism, they seem to say that you cannot be a hero unless you are moral. And you get the image of the hero that does great things. Napoleon, who goes out and reshapes the map of Europe, and yet he's not a moral person. And so people say, well, he cannot be a hero. He's not moral. And so oftentimes being moral seems to be the concept of being heroic. And yet just simply personal morality doesn't seem to be enough to attain this heroic state. And so is a hero somebody who is necessarily involved in, you might say, the shaping of broader culture or shaping the world of people around him? Or can a hero be someone who is, as I said before, simply lives an individual or personal life?
I think there can be an element of latent heroism in a completely private life, because the qualities which enable you to be heroic in a public sense must be there in a situation in which that is not called for. I'm thinking of who is that? Oh no, Cincinnatus, who was a private man after having been kicked out, of course, but he was he had the noble characteristics necessary to be heroic, but those did not come into play until he was called by his country to go forth, defeat their enemies, and then relinquish his power. However, even though it was not displayed until that opportunity came about, he was still those character qualities were still latent within him, and so I would say that he's just as much heroic as he was when he was actually executing his deeds. Just it wasn't evident to public.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't being demonstrated.
Yeah, a sort of potential heroism that's not yet brought to a moment of necessary actualization on the bigger stage. One phrase is oftentimes rumbled around in my head is a little phrase. It says, live in obscurity. Live in obscurity. And having the desire to push away from or to avoid public view has oftentimes seemed to me to be an interesting goal. I mean, just basically the idea, try to work faithfully, but when the TV news shows up and wants to do an interview, politely say no. That there's a necessity to avoid fame, and yet there seems to be something of the bigger stage that heroism demands. And would it be moral or would it be responsible to avoid that bigger stage that sometimes heroism demands?
I suppose it would depend upon the context and why you would be taking the bigger stage. Because you can see that Achilles would very gladly take the bigger stage, although for very questionable motivations that would certainly not be considered heroic. So I do think that it depends on whether you are given, whether it's part of your responsibility towards those around you, and in Achilles' sense it would be the people who are under his command and the general Achaean army at large, whether it is involved in your responsibility to take the center stage, as it were. If it is simply for your own thing, not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Achilles does seem to have an interest in the big stage. I think it's very interesting when the embassy comes to him. What he's doing, he's playing on his harp, singing the songs of the great warriors of old. And that always seems to be an effective image to understand Achilles, that he loves the songs about the great warriors of the old, and he wants to get in them. And it's a little bit like somebody who's always watching the news and wants to get on it. I guess I'm trying to figure out how much a wise individual will avoid that sort of public work well, one other example, when Dante is making fun of the Florentines, he says that when there's a political office available in Florence, half the citizens say, choose me, choose me. Everybody wants to get into office. Everybody's running for election. And at one point, it seems that that sort of desire to want to be the big guy, want to be the person that has the big position, that's lamentable. But then on the other hand, if all good men are simply living in private, what happens to our common life? And so, what should be the attitude of a good man towards, you might say, the big stage of public life?
Well, I would think we can connect this, I guess, to examination of just ambition. I think ambition is not a necessarily bad thing to have. Great things are accomplished by people wanting to do them. So, in order for things to get done, people have to have the resolve and the desire to go forth and accomplish things that they need to. And Achilles' desire to attain glory in battle and to accomplish great things is not necessarily bad either. It's just the fact that he glorifies that above all else, and he stakes his identity in that. So I don't know that it's not that ambition is, and wanting to accomplish great deeds in the eyes of the world is necessarily evil. It's just that if it's your own reputation that you're thinking for instead of the things that are, like the actual deed itself, if you want to do something so that you'll be known for it, that's a great deal different from wanting to do something because it needs to be done. So a noble ambition recognizes that something is necessary or good and goes forth and accomplishes it. An ignoble ambition recognizes that there's something that everyone else wants to be done, or even needs to be done, and goes forth and does it for the recognition that they're going to get for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a little comment Augustine makes about nations. He says, poor nations conquer for pleasure, good nations conquer when necessary. Thank you very much. Other questions?
Yeah, so amazing paper. I really enjoyed it. But in contrast Tolstoy's view of heroism with Homer's. And so I think I don't have your paper in front of me, so I can't reference the line, but you mentioned something like, in Tolstoy's point of view, like people were heroes and they succeeded with great armies at their back, whereas Homer's heroes didn't. They're sort of like one-man shows. And so my question is, do you think that Homer's view of heroism would have changed had he lived in a different time? Or had Tolstoy's view of heroism changed had he lived in a different time or at a different war?
That is very interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not particularly familiar with military strategy. I don't even necessarily think that Homer's idea of heroism as portrayed in his epics even necessarily actually reflects his concept of his current time, because nobody could have possibly been like Diomedes and sent Ares screaming back to Mount Olympus. I think that perhaps what Homer was trying to get out, and classicists correct me if I'm wrong, he was exaggerating qualities such as prowess and courage, and just sort of glorifying them, putting them on a pedestal by making them impossibly great. So I don't know that Tolstoy's practical view of heroism in war would have been as greatly different. I do think that I do think that probably had he lived in a different time, in which like explosives and guns and things like that render mass destruction a lot more easy from a distance, he probably would have found that his idea of courage in battle would probably have been a little different, probably.
So, what would you say is the difference between villainy and heroism? Because villains seem to, like heroes, get a great amount of recognition, especially when they face off against heroes in epic battles. What makes a villain different from a hero? Is it because he hasn't overcome himself, or perhaps can a villain overcome himself? And the thing that makes him a villain is because he does what's right in his own eyes, or doesn't do that end. What would you say is the difference between a hero and a villain?
Well, it depends on what kind of villain you're talking about. There are certain villains in various stories that are very shallow and do evil simply because it's evil. For those that are doing evil because they think that it's ultimately justified, I would say that that's sort of a very, very perverted version of heroism, especially if they think that what they're doing is ultimately for the benefit of others. I would say that they're not seeing things clearly, that they're not understanding, typically they're not understanding reality, and usually they are not charitable towards the individual. I think that's a big part of heroism. It's not just that you're thinking of the crowd or just of the general population. You need to be able to interact with humility with the person standing right next to you. I would say that the distinction between villains, as you say, and heroes is that they do a hero actually understands what is good and is willing to execute it. So, does that answer your question?
But it seems almost that villains have the same sort of determination that a hero would have in terms of reaching their end goal.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think, and it also seems that a villain, sometimes he doesn't seek publicity, it's like maybe he just seeks a personal goal. But like, what would you say the defining factor between the two?
I mean, ultimately speaking, it is a question of morality, and the villain typically is trying to do something wrong. I'm not entirely. I did say that there, in terms of capability, is not what makes a hero or a villain, for that matter. It is the ability to actually see what is good and pursue it in a way that I'm trying to find the line that I was going to reference. I think it is ultimately a question of understanding what is right and what is wrong. Because I mean, that is ultimately what makes the villain. The villain is that he's going after something that is evil. So, yes, Sarah.
So kind of run off of Peter's question, what would you do with a villain like Thanos, who believes, sorry, but what would you do with a villain like that, or modern day villains, if you will, who are doing what they think is right? If the villain, if the whole differentiation between the hero and the villain is that the hero follows what good and the villain most of the time follows what is bad, then in the case of Thanos, he's doing what he thinks is right, even though, I mean, I don't know, that could be a debate whether or not, if you agree or disagree with Thanos. So, what then becomes, I guess, the standard of good that the hero must follow? Does he follow what he thinks is right, or what, I guess, to put a Christian side to it, what, God says that's right?
Well, although I certainly don't think that Marvel is attempting to acknowledge Christian standards, I do think that they are the ultimate standards and that everyone is beholden to them whether they acknowledge them or not. That being said, I think even someone like Thanos probably ought to be able to, I still can't understand why he thinks that genocide is justifiable. But yes, I do think that the standards given by the Bible are the ultimate standards. Are you from New York? I'm not from New York.
Why did you say it?
Oh, I have no idea. It was just the first team that came to my head. There. I know people know who they are. I'm not a baseball person, so it's just a random choice. Yes, Anna?
First off, I'm glad to be here. Heroism is always a fun topic. I had a question. I obviously don't have your favorite reference, so I'm going based off my memory here. When you were discussing the Iliad and saying how Achilles, his character shift after Patroclus' death was, quote, a step closer to true heroism. Could you elaborate on that? I wasn't quite sure what you meant.
Alright, yes. So, before Patroclus dies, Achilles is dead set on abandoning all of his fellows. He's just sort of sitting there by his ships, not only by sitting there himself, depriving everyone else of their greatest fighter, but also depriving his men of they're just all sitting there playing with their discuses. So, when Patroclus dies, Achilles realizes the consequences of his actions, and it hits him home where all of the other deaths would not have, because Patroclus is his best friend, of course. So, in that pain, his eyes are opened to the more extensive destruction that he has caused by not fighting, and that evokes like the quote I gave from him. If I can find it. He feels guilty about that, and so he has started to understand the value of all these lives that he has needlessly sacrificed, and by doing that, by understanding that, whereas he did not before, he's coming closer to the possibility of interacting with the individual, not only with his friend, but seeing the lives of all of the other Greek soldiers as worth something, and that I would say makes him significantly more heroic than he was previously. So then, after that, he recognizes it, and also I think he recognizes the contrast between Patroclus and himself. You can see Patroclus going forth, and he's really quite a selfless character. Mr. Hendricks wanted me to include the scene with Eurypylus. I could not fit it in. I was already over the word count. But then you see Patroclus going, he fights in another situation when he sees his comrade die, and is just overcome by grief and goes and acts upon that to continue fighting on behalf of his other comrades who are not fallen. It's another time when Homer addresses him as the second person. So I do think that Achilles recognizes that difference, and he not only does he feel guilty and shame for his previous actions, he then makes a change. He goes and he fights, and I would say that demonstrates that he has had a change of heart and has become more heroic.
Mm-hmm. And what is the true heroism here? Is it saving the Argives, or is it stepping towards reconciliation with his rage against Priam?
I would argue that they're not the same, but they are both involved in this idea of him looking outside of himself in his motivations. So he's overcome his pride, and for both of those, he rescues the Argives. He has recognized their worth and is now going to go fight for them, and that is heroic because he's acting on a cause outside of himself. And also with Priam, he's also acting on a cause outside of himself. It's not, although I suppose you could argue that he's going to get the gods very furious with him. He doesn't retain Priam's body, Hector's body, but he treats Priam very nicely. And he's brought to a state of fellow humanity in that situation with Priam. And I think that is the essential point, is that he is now regarding himself as a human among fellow humans, and is now willing to act for the sake of others, whether it be in a situation with Priam or with the salvation of the Argives.
So kind of bouncing off of Anna's question, I was wondering if you would truly argue if Achilles changed after Patroclus' death, or it was more his rage was then fixated on something else. Because obviously he did try to desecrate Hector's body after killing him, and I always got the impression that it was not so much a character change on his part after Patroclus died, but more that rage that had been focused on Agamemnon now came in full swing towards Achilles. I never really, and I guess I want to hear your thoughts on this, because you also said that he was ashamed of his past actions. So yeah, I guess what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Okay, yes. So I think that Achilles' character undergoes two major transitions. There is the transition at Patroclus' death, where he repents, shall we say, of his, quite frankly, very noble actions in completely abandoning his compatriots. Of course, his anger has now been completely settled on Hector, and he is still definitely in pursuit of his own rage at this point. However, he has acknowledged his own guilt for allowing the Argives' destruction. Then, after Hector is killed, after he kills Hector, he is still completely, he's restless, he's not resolved. And it is only in the reconciliation with Priam that he finds resolution, and then, there's the quote that I mentioned. right after that, he before he meets with Priam, he's sort of in this stage of restlessness and just kind of general misery, honestly. He can't sleep, and he's mourning for Patroclus. He's trying to take it out on Hector's corpse. It isn't satisfying him. Then, after he has his reconciliation scene with Priam, he his rage finally dies. And I would say that that moment of humility and reconciliation and treating the king gently, feeling the loss of the loss of Patroclus, understanding how Priam mourns the loss of his own son because his own father will soon lose Achilles because he's doomed. That moment of humanity marks the second transition in Achilles' character, and then only then does he find resolution.
So I guess just so I comprehend it better, would you say more that his true character change was with Priam, since that was the first action that actually wasn't based on rage, and he just started making that transition with Patroclus' death? Because I'm still kind of wrapping I guess I'm having trouble seeing his actions going into battle after Patroclus' death, after Hector, as really a change of character.
Yes. So, to be sure, the scene with Priam is more significant in terms of Achilles' character. The scene with Patroclus is an absolutely necessary precursor, but it is the scene with Priam that finally brings resolution. And it's the main change. All right. Yes.
So I think you pointed out that Tolstoy is writing in this epic tradition of Homer, but he sort of consciously rejects the fantastical, epical elements in favor of a more stark realism. But it certainly implies that he's very familiar with Homer. And you also pointed out that heroism in both accounts was on display in the act of reconciliation, which I think is very interesting. But when you were reading it, it made me think of something that I think is interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. That Achilles has a fundamental choice of the immortal glory or the homecoming, right? The Theos Apiton or Gnostos. And I think what makes Achilles tragic is he chooses immortal glory over the homecoming, whereas Odysseus gets to go home and has a satisfying conclusion. But it seems like Andre, also following in Achilles' footsteps, chooses that immortal glory, and neither one get a true homecoming. Do you think there's something in the actual act of reconciliation and the display of heroism in that reconciliation that maybe, where in some sense they both receive that Gnostos, that homecoming, in the act of reconciliation itself? And does that play into the idea of heroism in your ideas?
Yes, I definitely think so. Whereas you see with Odysseus, his homecoming is sort of, as Veronica pointed out earlier, the return to the full completion of his identity. With Andre and Achilles, they find, while not the literal homecoming, the same completion in the reconciliation, and not only the reconcilement with their respective enemies, but the redemption of their own characters, which in a sense does bring the same sense of completion and even homecoming to their own persons. And while it's not a literal homecoming, I think it is a figurative one in the sense that their identities have been consummated. Yes?
In your opinion, which Iliad character best exemplifies the classical hero?
The classical hero?
Yes.
I would say, you gotta give it to Hector. He is not only he has all of the characteristic traits of the epic hero. Of course, he isn't a match for Achilles, but he's this incredibly strong, courageous, dutiful person. And not only is he capable in battle, but he also has that outward motivation. It's not all about him, it's not all about his glory. He's there, he's for there to protect his family, he's Andromache and his Dianax, but also his city, and he recognizes that he has a duty to his country. So I would say that between the qualities of what I've identified as heroism and also of epic heroism, that he's sort of the perfect combination of the two, and I would say that he exemplifies the ideal possible hero.
Thank you, Ms. Labonte.